Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing great. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much. And we're on part 2 of our story, which is very, very exciting because Roland Peterson has discovered that the house that his wife has bought is not quite what he was expecting. And he's beginning to realise that this house has got quite a dark history behind it. So we're about to find out more about that. But before we continue with the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue with part 2 of our story. Roland Peterson's eyes grew round as he listened to what his wife had to tell him. It was sobering. His breathing became quite heavy with her words. It certainly explained why the Grey Lady possessed such a depressed, inauspicious energy. He wondered if it could be that the sorrowful tragedy concerning Oliver Bennet had somehow been soaked up by the house like a sponge. It was more than likely. He looked at Lizelle with a confounded expression on his face. "You're telling me the estate agent told you all this concerning the property?" he asked. "I'm surprised he'd tell you so much, if he was eager for a sale and could see you were keen on the house. It's hardly a good sales technique, is it, to tell you about the house's dark history?" "I expect he didn't have much choice in the matter," she said. "I think it's somewhere in their code of ethics, isn't it? Even if it is an urban legend, to tell me all the stories connected to the house. Let's just say he did better than that," she said proudly. "He showed me the newspaper article written about the case in the 1800s. It was fascinating. I mean, it seems so far-fetched and ludicrous, does it not? But it was there. It was there in black and white, Roland, to read. So it would seem the family, the Bennet family, that is, were terrorised by something despicable. But that's not all to my story." "There's more?" asked Roland, looking as if he was about to choke on a piece of invisible coal stuck at the back of his throat. He didn't like the sound of more. "Of course there's more, you nincompoop," said Lizelle, laughing in delight. "Don't you just love stories like this? They keep you second-guessing, wondering what really goes on in this world of ours. Some people may say it's all woo-woo, but I've got an open mind about these things. My dad used to say that not everything is simply just black and white, and that there is one certainty in life, and that we're certain not to know it all." "Well, that's an interesting way to put it," said Roland reflectively. "And of course your father was absolutely right." Roland thought that the story concerning the Grey Lady, the house that they had purchased, even if it had happened a long time ago, certainly tugged at his discomfort about the place all the more. It was true that Mr. Bennet had felt desolate after losing his wife to this dreadful wolf-like humanoid. He wondered if the Victorian house was carrying all the family's grief, like a bride holding on to her bouquet, refusing to let it go. Lizette, seeing that she had her husband's undivided attention, continued, "Well, more recently, about 50 years ago, the Grey Lady was purchased by a man called Edmund Sinclair and his wife Molly. They both fell passionately in love with the property. And I mean, who can blame them? Imagine how spectacular it was back in the day. They bought it at once. Now, Edmund's a pretty old-fashioned name, don't you think? I actually like the name a lot. They should use it more these days. Maybe if we have a boy, Roland, we should call it Edmund one day. I kind of like it. Well, the couple, they had 4 children. 3 of them who claimed to have seen a wolf-like humanoid on this very property, lurking in the woods, watching them when they were playing games out of doors. Can you believe that? Mr. Sinclair thought they'd heard the legend concerning his house in the 1800s and were making up fictitious stories to validate the claims made by Oliver Bennet, so that they could spin some kind of sensational yarn to all their friends back at school, and subsequently perpetuate the urban legend. One day Edmund Sinclair's wife vanished, in exactly the same way that Eleanor Bennet had done in the 1800s. The children had heard the couple have a disagreement during the evening, but they soon made up, and then went to bed. The following morning, after Edmund's wife had risen early, before anybody else in the house, she was never ever seen again after that. It was believed animal imprints, similar to those found by Mr. Oliver Bennett in the 1800s, were found by Edmund Sinclair in the woodgrove. The entire grove stank of death and decay. He said it smelt so vile, like a decomposing corpse, only worse. But he could not locate the mysterious source of the smell. The police were naturally called on the scene to search for Molly. They could make no sense of the enigmatic large wolf-like prints in the grove that were clearly made by a bipedal creature standing upright on two legs. But what it was, no one knew. The disgusting smell that awaited them in the grove was said to have caused those investigating the incident to have lucid nightmares for many days after the event. They searched the entire grove for the whereabouts of Molly, but she was never ever found. The officers were completely stumped to find her sneakers that she'd been wearing that morning, tied up on a tree, as if they'd been deliberately placed there, almost to taunt them. Well, that's what they felt anyway. Mr. Sinclair said that his wife would never ever have removed her sneakers like that. So what on earth were they doing as a pair tied together on the tree by their laces, hanging from the branches like a pair of dangling Christmas decorations? It certainly appeared to be a message of some kind. During the whole search, the officers claimed something evil, very malevolent, had been watching them, although they physically saw nothing. They believed that Edmund's wife had come to a tragic, fortuitous end at the hands of a dangerous, deadly predator, the likes of such they'd never seen before. One of the children told the police she had heard her mother crying out in the early hours of the morning. She had been upstairs at the time, fast asleep, and had woken up in a daze, glancing briefly out of the window to see what she described as the scariest, most horrible monster she'd ever seen in her entire life, standing up on two legs with a human-like stature, but the face of a wolf. She had seen her mother being flung onto the creature's back, and sensing it had an audience, it had looked up at her at the window and appeared to be smiling at her, while globlets of drool spilled down its jaws. She said her mother's frantic cries scared the bejesus out of her, and she quickly returned to bed, persuading herself it had all been a horrible nightmare, and in the morning she'd realize that she had imagined the whole thing. But she soon realized, after the prints were recovered in the grove by the police, that her nightmare had in fact been real. To all intents and purposes, the family remained at the Grey Lady, and much like Oliver Bennett had done in the 18th century, Edmund Sinclair was filled with furious rage towards the mysterious wolf-like humanoid. He tried to locate the creature, but to no avail. He even organized a team of hunters, along with their sniffer dogs, to try and locate the creature's whereabouts so that they could ultimately kill him. It would seem some of the sniffer dogs became too afraid to go into the woodgrove and began to cower, so their handlers took them home. The hunters all felt a sense of grave foreboding as they searched the grove for any signs of the mysterious beast. Most believed they were being watched and stalked by something the whole time. Some felt incredibly threatened by an ominous sense of foreboding that they refused to continue searching the grove. Their advice to Mr. Edmund Sinclair was to get the hell out of this place, to leave the Grey Lady. But Edmund Sinclair tirelessly spent many restless years hoping to locate the beast that had abducted and killed his wife. He believed the creature was there in the grove somewhere, but he and his children never ever saw it again.
"You mean to tell me, Lizelle, that the estate agent tells you all this about the property concerning its history?" said Roland, unable to hide the confoundment that had disturbed the features on his face. "Yet you still wanted to buy this property from him. He must have thought his Christmases had all come at once. He's been trying to sell this place for 20 years, and then you come along."
Lizelle laughed.
"Yes, he did. He said to me, 'Are you sure you want this place, after everything I've told you?' I mean, as if I'm going to be concerned about a wolf-like humanoid coming after us. I'm not stupid. And if the story has put off other people buying this place, all well and good, she laughed. Their loss is our gain, Roland. Roland's wife's words made him feel sick to the core of his stomach. He had heard those words being spoken before, by Dorothy Pender, when she'd purchased a house with such a negative history, and a year later she was dead.
Look, Lizelle,
said Roland uncomfortably.
Are you sure you want this house?
Lizelle looked at Roland in astonishment. Of course I'm sure. Anyway, it's a bit late to change my mind, isn't it? I've already purchased the place for the both of us. Don't be intimidated, Roland, about all the work. I've got a good team working on the place. Before long, we'll be moving into the Grey Lady. I don't know about you, but I can barely wait. Roland's heart sank. He certainly did not have the heart or the will to tell Lizelle that moving into the Grey Lady was something that he'd very much like to postpone for as long as possible. Indeed, he'd like to put the house straight back on the market and try to sell it for another 20 years. But he knew that that was not a solution to their problem. He abhorred the place. He hated it with every single fibre in his being. But he couldn't tell Lizelle that. She was so in love with the property. He could only hope with the renovations the house might lose some of its heaviness. But he was very doubtful that it actually would. Paul Benelodge's account.
My name is Paul Benelodge. I've been working on historic homes for over 20 years or so, with my constructing team, bringing the houses of history back into shape, so they look like they did when they were first constructed, so that if you didn't know any better, you'd likely believe we had dragged the house kicking and screaming from the 18th century into the modern-day 21st century. You have to have an expert knowledge in the history of old houses, which is my speciality, of course, and I'm very good at working on Victorian properties most especially, bringing this extraordinary metamorphosis about. It's rather like being a reconstructive surgeon, I suspect, in a manner of speaking, but in the construction business, bringing to life the bones of a house that has become emaciated, battle-weary, from the erosion of time. I get a remarkable great sense of satisfaction working on these precious gems from our past, making them bloom again. I assure you, over 20 years on working in historic homes, me and my team have experienced strange phenomenon from time to time that could only be described as not of this world, as sometimes as we're working on houses where old memories contained within the walls are being played back in our time-space. We have heard disembodied voices, smelt strange, peculiar smells, sometimes even been physically touched, or had strange encounters with people that we realize later must have actually been a ghost, for they just disappeared in front of us, like a wisp of smoke. This has happened more times than I actually care to count. Ostensibly, it is not terribly unusual for us to experience something when we're busy working on an old property, as our activities often stir up strange phenomena that we cannot explain, but it usually goes away once we've completed the job. Working together with my team, I've seen some bizarre, rather idiosyncratic things over the years. But then again, you do have to remember, when you're buying an old house where people have lived and died and played out their lives, it would seem an energy reservoir is almost certainly left behind. Which is why, of course, you find old houses have so much character, charm, great personality. If you look at a new, more modern property, for example, where no one has ever lived in it before, you will find the energy is flat, benign, relatively nondescript, so to speak. It's rather like looking at a blank canvas on the wall, that the artist has not brought to life with his expression, using the medium of paint. Or again, like staring at a brand new fish tank that has not developed a natural ecosystem yet. There is no doubt in my mind that you can feel the vacuousness of such a space that has been untampered with, rather like an unfurnished room that badly needs to be decorated. Someone invariably has to move into the property to bring some energy and life into the place. I believe magnificent houses from our past that have been happily and well lived in have soaked up the energy of the previous residents that have resided within its depths, which in my humble opinion makes an old house infinitely more superior in the interests it obviously engenders. It is the difference between walking into a yard that has only just been planted up with small trees and tiny little rose bushes, as opposed to walking into a fully established mature garden, where the old glorious trees stand tall and proud with outstretched sculptural branches and large impressive trunks securely anchored to the ground. Then there are the shrubs, the bushes, the mature rose plants that are astoundingly beautiful, and over the years have gladly contributed to making the garden even more beguiling and prepossessing. It becomes like a well-developed coral reef that over time begins to become more and more magnificent, unless, of course, the beauty has been jeopardized by the damage we might inflict on it, which can cause a garden or a coral reef to unfortunately die. Getting back to the point of this story of mine, I'm in charge of a team of men whom I supervise in all manner of restoration projects when it comes to old houses. I like to take on any challenge, but the Grey Lady was one of the most intimidating ventures of my entire life. The moment I drove up the driveway to meet the new owner, a woman called Lizelle Peterson, I was struck by how ominous and foreboding the Grey Lady appeared. The house exuded what I can only describe as a sorrowful, mournful energy, almost as if the former residents of the property had impregnated the place with an all-encompassing grief, as if the foundations of the very house were basking in a brooding melancholia that it could not shake off, rather like the ticks on a dog's coat that have made their home happily in its hair and simply refuse to leave. The house was beautiful, of course, that was beyond doubt, although in a bad state of repair, needing quite a bit of work on it. Yet at the same time it was sinister and rather menacing, like the Ice Queen in Narnia in the children's book, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. It had been abandoned by neglect, but even at a first glance I could see the place had great potential. It rested on good bones, which meant we could bring it back to shape. But the question on my mind was, would the dark energy actually shift? That I had to ask myself. But I was up to the challenge, as was my team of dedicated workers, who have not yet seen the house before I had, but I knew that they would be on board, as they were not intimidated by hard work of any kind.
"Oh, I'm so glad you came," Lizelle Peterson greeted me warmly, as I climbed out of my truck, standing anchored to the ground, that was cluttered with leaves and rambling ivy, as I stared at the Grey Lady, taking her all in, almost as if I was in an art gallery, getting the measure of her painting. Mrs. Peterson exuded enthusiasm and passion. I could see she had fallen in love with the Grey Lady, and believed that she could be restored to her former glory. And if she thought that the Grey Lady exuded a sorrowful, mournful energy, she expressed no such misgivings about the property, but only shared with me her bitter disappointment that her husband Roland Peterson clearly had not been enamoured by the house, and was privately aggrieved that Lizelle had bought the mansion. Lizelle Peterson was in her mid-30s, I suspect, an attractive woman with short-cropped hazelnut-highlighted hair and warm, lively brown eyes. The type of woman that you like at once,
I knew she was a person who was her true authentic self, not trying to be something she was not. And that, I have to say, is a quality I admire in people, as I do also in houses. She informed me that she'd met her husband Roland on a cruise liner. They'd fallen in love and got married 4 months later, and as a consequence had ruffled more than a few feathers of both their families and friends, whom had tirelessly warned the couple that they were rushing things. "When you know," she told me. "Lots of people weren't happy about us getting married so quickly, but we were of the opinion, why wait? We love each other. We want to be together forever. To hell with what others think." She laughed. "Anyway," she continued, "my husband Roland is a very good man, a man of integrity, a man of great charm. He cared about one thing, and that was making me happy and giving me my heart's desires. He said I could go and buy the house of my dreams to raise our family in, and that I had free rein to buy any place I liked for us, within a generous budget, of course. And I did just that. I didn't need much encouragement. And with a dogged determination, I went out house hunting. In truth, I had absolutely no idea what I was looking for, until I laid eyes on the grey lady. I was like a kid in a candy store, I suspect. You see, no one in my entire life had said to me, 'You choose, Lizelle.' Growing up, I was the youngest of 8 children. My parents always made the decisions for my life. They decided where the family would ultimately go on our annual vacations. My mother chose my wardrobe, the schools and colleges I would frequent. But no one ever stopped to say to me, 'Lizelle, you choose. You make the choice.' When Roland said that I could choose the house we were to live in, I felt like a princess in charge of her own castle. I felt incredibly empowered. It was the most liberating feeling of my entire life. I was standing in the estate agent's window, and I saw a photograph of the grey lady on display. I had no idea it had been sitting there for over 20 long years, with no one showing even a fleeting interest in the place. I told the estate agent to take me to the property at once, and then I knew, in that second, the moment I laid eyes on it, that this house was for me. This house was for Roland and I to lay down roots. Unfortunately, I got a sense when I showed Roland the house. The feeling was not reciprocated. He wasn't enamoured or even best pleased with what I'd chosen for us. Bless his cotton socks, he tried to hide it well, of course, but I could tell he was thrown off his perch. He didn't expect me to choose a place like this, and I know he's bitterly disappointed. I think he thought I'd have bought some comfortable ranch-style house in the Colorado hills, in good condition, surrounded by pristine countryside, maybe a pond or lake, something like that. But all this," she said, throwing her arms towards the house, "this he didn't expect. Instead, I brought him to an old house, shaded by trees, with a dark, gloomy ambience, and in a bad state of repair. And that did not go down terribly well." I cleared my throat and said, "Well, it isn't for anyone, is it? It must have been a shock for him when you brought him here, and he saw what a dreadful state the place was in. Anyone can see this property has been abandoned for many years. It must have been intimidating for your husband to see it like this." Lizelle raised a brow. "I thought he'd see beyond all this. I thought he was a visionary like myself and could see the potential of this place. But I think he thought I had dragged him along to his worst nightmare. He doesn't see through my eyes what this place could potentially become. When I told him about the history connected to the grey house, he didn't seem remotely amused about it. He said to me, 'You knew all this, and you still bought the place?' He couldn't make sense of that at all. He told me a few days later that his own grandmother had a friend called Dorothy Pender, who had bought a house once, where the owner had murdered her husband. You must forgive me, I don't know the macabre details of the story, and I don't want to either. But my husband visited that house as a boy, as he was invited there for tea with his grandmother Violet,
at Dorothy Pender's house. At the time he didn't know what had happened at the property, but he found the energy nauseatingly unsettling and insufferable. So he confided in his grandmother about the foreboding energy he picked up of the house, and she told him about the murder that had taken place there. I gather a year after Mrs. Pender moved into that house, she died, in very mysterious circumstances. Apparently she took a tumble down the stairs. My husband's grandmother believed emphatically the house was responsible for Dorothy Pender's tragic fortuitous passing. He claimed that the moment she moved into the place, she was flooded with migraine headaches and nausea, and feeling increasingly unwell. Violet, of course, warned Dorothy to sell up the property at once and to leave the house, but Dorothy refused to listen. So that's what my husband told me, and honestly, I think it was just an unfortunate accident. But my husband is reading so much into this all. I think he thinks the Grey Lady is as inauspicious as Dorothy Pender's house was back then, although of course he didn't say as much in so many words. But it's ridiculous to think like he does, don't you think?
Well, it's not necessarily ridiculous. It's his opinion, is it not? I said gingerly. I mean, houses definitely have energy. The energy leaves an imprint on our time-space. If you're living in a property where something bad happened, that dark energy can affect you on an unconscious level, rather negatively, drag you down perhaps, influence you in some way, even impact your health. I know this from working on old places myself. Some places indeed have a benevolent energy, others not so much. It sounds nonsensical, I know, but energy is real. It's around us, it's everywhere, and in everything. And even inanimate objects like homes absorb energy. So, that's what I can say to you. There must have been a negative energy in Dorothy Pender's house. But whether it had anything to do with her accident, I have no idea.
I hadn't thought of it like that, said Lizelle. I think my husband feels the Grey Lady has a negative energy. He didn't say that straight to me, of course, but I'm not stupid. I mean, I can read between the lines, can't I? You should have seen his face when he saw it for the first time. He was mortified, absolutely mortified. I think that's the only way to describe the expression on his face. I do feel bad for him, of course I do, but not bad enough to regret buying this place. You're an expert. You've worked on old houses hundreds of times before. What do you think of the Grey Lady's energy? Does it disturb you? Are you picking up any bad vibes on the property? Because if you are, why am I not seeing it? All I'm seeing is what the house will one day become, when she's brought back to her former glory.
I shuffled awkwardly on my feet. Some people are drawn to houses, ma'am, like you were drawn to your husband on that ocean liner. It's not something you can actually explain tangibly. Maybe the Grey Lady is reaching out to you for help, and you've responded to her cries. Stranger things have happened, you know. But I'm not going to lie to you, Mrs. Peterson. The house does possess a menacing energy, as if something very bad happened here. Do you know anything about the history concerning this house? It's always good to look into the history of any house you buy, especially if it's old. Think about it. If you were marrying a man who had been through 5 wives, you'd be an absolute fool not to investigate what went wrong with all his previous marriages, would you not?
That does make an awful lot of sense, Mr. Benalodge. Now that you mention it, of course. I suppose it does explain why the Grey Lady never sold over the last 20 years. I can tell you the history connected to this place in detail if you like. In short, 2 people went missing in this particular house, and I suspect it put people off buying it. I mean, old Victorian houses like this are usually highly sought after and in great demand, but this house has not sold in so many years. It's desperately sad. But I really want to fix her up, and in my gut, I know it's the right decision for me. I meant to live here. Coming here for the first time with that estate agent was for me like coming home. All the stories connected to this property did not put me off buying it in the slightest. On the contrary, made me want to buy this place all the more. At the moment, Mr. Benelodge, me and my husband are currently renting a place in Denver. I think he's glad to leave the gutting of the Grey Lady to me. I'm sure he's privately dreading moving into this place. But I'm hoping by the time you guys have transformed it, he'll love it as much as I do. I just know it's going to look amazing when it's completed. I just hope that Roland will share my enthusiasm.
Mrs. Peterson, we can work miracles in our restoration projects, I can assure you. But energy is another story. You need to look into ways you can shift the energy. But we can talk about that together later. Perhaps you can tell me a little about the history of this place. As you were saying, it might help me understand the house a little better. When Lizelle had completed telling me about the stories connected to the Grey Lady, I began to completely understand why the house seemed so desolate, so dreadfully defeated. It had picked up the brooding, deflated energy of the former residents of the home, namely 2 grieving men over the years who had lost their wives in very distressing situations, believing a beast that to me fits the description of a dogman abducted and lightly killed them. Some people, of course, believe cryptic creatures like Dogman and Bigfoot don't actually exist, but the idiosyncratic appears to have touched my life far too many times for me to doubt such things. Let's just say there are more things on heaven and earth than actually meets the eye. I suspect both men that lived in the Grey Lady had been filled with anger, frustration, and inconsolable grief, which are dense, low-frequency vibrations that easily invite disease and despair into our lives. The Grey Lady was like a prune marinating in her grief. It made sense to me that she was in such melancholia. I, of course, assured Lizelle Peterson that I would get my men working on the property at once. We would get the yard attended to, the paths in the woodgrove cleared. We would bring the Grey Lady back to what she'd been in the 1800s. I, of course, persuaded Lizelle Peterson, once this was completed, that we should get in a psychic medium or a priest to bless the house, to lift off the depression. Lizelle was excited about such an idea.
I know when I bring Roland back to the house, he's not going to believe it's the same place.
We will do our best, ma'am, to restore the Grey Lady for you, I assured her. But I had an instinctive hunch it was not going to be so easy.
So there we are. That's the end of part 2 of our story. Part 3 is tomorrow night. My word, do you think they're going to be able to lift the dark energy of the house? Well, we'll find out tomorrow night. Until next time, goodbye and good night.